What the subconscious mind of the charismatic extrovert is really seeking is external validation. External validation. Or maybe your more natural tendency was to be an extrovert, but your social anxiety was overriding your ability to enjoy the experience. All right, let's talk about the myths about being an introvert versus being an extrovert, because most people get it totally wrong, and a lot of people will actually categorize themselves into the wrong category because they're using the wrong criteria. So most people who are shy or have social anxiety will automatically categorize themselves as being an introvert. And that is the absolute worst criteria that a person can use in order to determine if they are, in fact, an introvert or an extrovert. And we'll talk about the reasons why and how also being an introvert versus an extrovert is not something that's set in stone. It can be something that shifts as a person experiences subconscious internal shifts, as I myself have experienced to a pretty deep degree. So, someone who is an extrovert tends to go wide and shallow with the topics of conversation, what you tend to bring to the table. Not always, but most of the time and often, as was me in my past. And an extrovert oftentimes tends to be a little bit more on the charismatic side, more outgoing, holds themselves with a stronger confidence, things like that, right? And so, because of that, we oftentimes will automatically assume, oh, if I don't have those things, I must be an introvert. And actually, I tend to enjoy conversations and time more with introverts, and some of my favorite introverts happen to also be some of the most confident, grounded, self assured people who I have ever known. And the reason why I tend to enjoy conversations with introverts so much is because they do take the conversations to a much deeper level. They tend to oftentimes have, not always, right? I don't want to blanket statement anything, tend to have more self awareness, and they've gone in and explored themselves more. And because of that, they know themselves more. And that makes it way more easy and effortless to go and have a deep conversation with someone. And in fact, a lot of introverts, it's not worth their time to have a conversation with someone if it's not taken to that deeper level. And so, because of this, introverts tend to be more guarded with their time and more selective with who they choose to spend their time with, the frequency and the length of time, right? And so, this is something that I didn't understand in the past. And I, in the past, used to be an extreme extrovert. I used to be an extreme extrovert. And now I tend to be the person who I find myself somewhere in the middle because I love, crave those conversations where we take it deep. It's because there's a level of deep understanding, and we like to talk about these things, and it's fun and exciting, and sometimes also very vulnerable. And these ways of communicating are the ways that we feel seen and heard and understood, right? And when a person finally learns how to do that and the importance of it and has the bravery to make it happen, it becomes something that you crave, right? And so let's talk about the false criteria of what most people use when they're trying to categorize themselves: introvert, extrovert, being shy, social anxiety, things like that. When someone has those things, those are things that point to somewhere in your subconscious mind, in your nervous system, that points to an emotional wound of the past or a string of many that has not healed or been resolved. So, being shy, what that means is it means you have a fear of rejection. That creates social anxiety. That can sometimes create self isolation. If you have social anxiety, then it's going to be hard to enjoy the presence of the other person if your anxiety is overriding the experience, right? And so it's something to heal from and recover from. It is not a normal, natural, or healthy state to be in. It means that somewhere in your past, you had an experience or a string of experiences, or maybe your entire childhood, where you did not feel safe enough to be yourself, where you began to express yourself as we all do when we are babies and infants and toddlers and little kids, right? The normal, natural thing is to express ourselves fully, wholly, and completely. And when we do that, if we are met back with either being, someone's dismissive towards us or belittles us or shames us or makes fun of us, or we're not seen and heard and understood and loved and accepted, it teaches the subconscious mind that says, oh, I must be fundamentally flawed. And it doesn't feel good to be rejected. It doesn't feel good to express myself and be dismissed. Therefore, the safer thing is to self-isolate. The safer thing is to not present myself to other people in a way where I feel seen, because when I did that in the past, it didn't feel good and it was deeply emotionally hurtful. So this is not a conversation your conscious rational mind is happening. This is just all happening in your subconscious mind, right? And this is 100% of the time, this is why a person is shy or has social anxiety. It comes from things that have happened in your past that have resulted in a fear of rejection. That fear of rejection showed up because of how you were treated in the past when you just were yourself, right? And someone didn't know what to do with the awesomeness of you. And so your subconscious mind said, hey, let's self-isolate and hide. And when we are in the presence of other people, we have social anxiety because we fear that that might happen again. And that's deeply emotionally painful. That experience has happened to an enormous amount of people, which is why there's a lot of people who have anxiety and fear of rejection, right? Things like this. Some things like having a narcissistic parent or a parent who was emotionally unavailable, or being bullied in school, or my clients are men overcoming pornography addiction, and a lot of them had those circumstances, and a lot of them were also sexually molested. 1 in 6 boys are sexually molested as children, and so the stats on that are like really alarming, quite alarming. And there's all sorts of things that can lead to feeling subconscious low self-worth, subconscious low self-worth. That can oftentimes lead to a person falsely believing that they're an extrovert simply based on the fact that they have social anxiety. Social anxiety means subconscious low self-worth and fear of rejection, and those things happen as a result of events that happened when you were younger. And so those are things that anyone and everyone can heal from, that anyone and everyone can heal from. And so let's flip it and go over to the extrovert side. So I myself used to be an extreme extrovert. I didn't want to spend a moment of time alone at all, okay? And I did show up with this charismatic extroversion, right? Where I just knew how to present myself in front of a room of people or an individual so that I could capture their attention in the way that they would react in a way that was pleasing to me. And there's a danger in this as well. For most people who are the charismatic extroverts of the world, not everyone, but for a grand majority, like how I used to carry myself, this is the truth and the reality of the situation. And it's something to be aware of when you are in the presence of a charismatic extrovert. And it's something to be aware of if you recognize this within yourself. Because when someone is that charismatic extrovert, and what the subconscious mind of the charismatic extrovert is really seeking is external validation. external validation from their audience, whether it's the audience of one, an individual that you are interacting with, or a whole crowd of people, right? And so this happens when an individual feels like they have that same fear of rejection as the person who is totally shy, who has an enormous amount of social anxiety, or even a little bit. The exact same fundamental thing, emotional wound in the subconscious mind and the nervous system is the same, identical. Fear of rejection, subconscious low self-worth, feelings of inadequacy, I am not good enough. Therefore, the charismatic extrovert has had a different strategy to achieve the same thing. What they're trying to achieve, whether you're the shy person who self-isolates, or you're the charismatic extrovert who is always around people. It's how can I not get rejected? How can I protect my nervous system by avoiding rejection? And so the charismatic extrovert has learned the exact behaviors in body language and tone of voice and all these things, and learned exactly how to show up in this world to get a reaction from another person that their feedback reinforces, hey, they like me, they laughed at my joke, I wore a sexy outfit and they gave me a long stare, all these things, right? It's the subconscious mind is fear of rejection. How can I show up in this world to get external validation? External validation. Now, the danger in this, see that external validation, what it really is an ego boost. External validation is an ego boost. The charismatic extrovert is riding the high of the ego boost from the external validation they just received from another person or group of people. And this is also a dangerous thing, right? And I'll admit, being that charismatic extrovert, when I lived that life, it was fun. It was fun, but it was because I was riding a constant high, and that was my surface level. What I didn't know and realize underneath what was really going on was that I did not know how to cultivate self-worth from within. The only way, the only place I knew where to get it was from the reactions of other people. This is a dangerous thing. This is a really dangerous thing. This means that what was really going on with me, and it took me well into my 30s to understand what I'm about to tell you, all of this stuff really, is that I had a deep fear of rejection, a deep fear of not being good enough, a deep fear of inadequacy. How did that make me show up in the world? Let me go try and prove that I am a valuable person. How do I do that? I make people laugh. I wear the sexy outfit and try to get the eyes. All of these things, right? And so while making someone laugh is a wonderful, beautiful thing in this world, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a wonderful thing to be celebrated, right? And it's a gift to be able to to help someone else fall into laughter, right? But when we're only doing it to seek external validation, that's a red flag. And most people who are these charismatic extroverts have blinders on, like I did, of self-awareness of what's really going on. Why are these behaviors showing up? And so back in 2016, I got brain damage from ingesting a naturally occurring seafood neurotoxin that's 1,000 times more potent than arsenic. It put a 19 millimeter lesion on the left front lobe of my brain. It gave me severe and complex PTSD. It really messed up my autonomic nervous system. I was in and out of the emergency room. Sometimes I would stop breathing. My heart would always try to stop beating. I was at really high risk of cardiac arrest and respiratory paralysis. Life was dangerous, and I didn't know if I was going to live or survive. And I had to take several years off of work to heal and recover. And through my healing journey with that, I was only going to recover physically. I would sometimes be bedridden for like 19 hours at a time. Boy, was that a kill to my ego. I used to be the person who would get my ride my ego boosting highs from like, oh, I canoed 800 miles down the Yukon River on a scientific data expedition. Oh, I led this wilderness therapy trip in Alaska for 49 days, yada, 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 rock climbing trip, whatever. And I used to live off of telling those stories. And now here I'm the girl who can barely walk in a straight line down the hallway. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to get back on my feet in a way that that I loved and I thrived off of. And so I had to, in order to heal from all that, I had to do some really, and I mean really deep inner work. The dark night of the soul. This is like, holy moly, watch out, world. And it is scary and it is intense. And it brought up all sorts of childhood traumas that I was ignorant to, had no idea. There's an amazing book called The Body Keeps the Score about trauma. And reading that book was a scary eye opener for me. Holy moly, was it terrifying? And as I did the inner work, I realized all this fear of rejection and all these things going on. And so as I healed from that, which took me years, I no longer showed up in the world in the same way. The way I showed up with other people was a little bit more akin to an introvert. And the only thing I wanted to talk about was the deepest self-awarenesses that I had within me and how I was healing from them and how important the healing journey is. And all around me, I just saw these patterns that I had discovered within myself. I was now seeing these patterns in other people, and all I could see was other people who could also use the healing journey and that they had their blinders on too, just like I did. And healing from these things is a beautiful thing. Healing from trauma is a gift. The ways that it allows us to live our life afterwards is to such a more full, rich, deeper degree. Our connections with other people, because we first went in and dug deep and discovered those things within us that need healing, that most people are just totally ignorant to, like I was. And it normally, for most people, it takes some incredibly deeply painful, challenging rock bottom, like it was for me, in order for someone to go in and do the work and do the healing, right? And so instead of being that person who would show up shallow and wide, it's like now I want to show up narrow and deep and just talk about these things. And it is so incredible and it is so exciting. And it doesn't have to be daunting. It can be exciting because when we gain these self-awarenesses, if we don't know what to do with the self-awarenesses, it is daunting and terrifying. And I went through that. I went through that part. But when we understand the tools and strategies on what to do with those new self-awarenesses and how to heal from them and what subconscious shifts must take place, it's no longer daunting, but it's exciting because you know you can get to this incredibly phenomenal place. And it is just, it's incredible. It's incredible. And so I used to be, I mean, as a child, I was incredibly shy, incredibly shy. I didn't develop, it was my entire 20s where I was the charismatic extrovert. I'll never forget my senior year of high school where I had my first experience where it really like clicked. And I was telling a story that was kind of self-deprecating humor. And I was telling it to these two girls in my high school class in the gym, like next to the bleachers, and they were cracking up laughing. And I remember that eh, the way that they responded, my subconscious mind lit up and was like, whoa, oh, that feels good. The way that they reacted to my story. And I was just dabbling into the charismatic extrovert part of it. And it was just like that reinforced it to show up in my personality. And it then like became who I was. But it was riding an ego boosting high because of the response I was getting from other people. But my entire childhood before that, it was like, whew, talking to someone, my voice would choke up and I couldn't get the words out. Like I would almost start crying if the teacher asked me to read in class, or if I was at the park and I wanted to pet someone's dog. As a child, I would be like way too nervous and anxious to even say, "Can I pet your dog?" And it would be like literally like 10 minutes of like being in this like freeze response, rehearsing that line over and over, and like finally like going up and like conjuring up the courage to say, "Can I pet your dog?" um, and so I've experienced both. The soup my entire childhood was that really shy. It would be like it's how we would call someone to be an introvert, but I didn't. All it was social anxiety. And then my entire 20s was the pendulum swing to the extreme opposite. And the 30s was healing. My living in my 30s was healing from that. And I'm still in my 30s, but it's now I show up in this different way where I can show up with that confidence. I can show up with charisma if I want to, but I don't care how a person responds. I'm not like triggered by other people's responses like I used to be. And I have that confidence, and it's a totally different and new and beautiful and amazing thing that we can all learn. It's a learned thing through healing and how we want to show up in the world, right? And now I can go days and days in a row without really spending, I don't have to go and spend all this time with other people to get that ego boosting high from their reaction, right? I can spend time on my own, by myself, working on my projects, doing meditation, creating content for my clients, reading books, going on walks, hiking in the forest, all of these things, right? Doing bird watching, like, and it's incredible. And then when I do come and spend time with other people, it is like the most beautiful thing. It's something that is so nourishing for my soul because I'm able to connect with people in this new and different and beautiful and fundamentally important way. And it's so much healthier, it's so much balanced. And this is what I want for everyone. But let me tie this all together. Let me wrap this up with something that I learned from Dr. Andrew Huberman, who is an amazing neurobiologist, who is a professor at Stanford University. From a more neurobiological perspective, so I was speaking from a psychological perspective, but our psychology and our neurobiology are greatly intertwined, right? And so, coming from a neurobiological perspective, Dr. Andrew Huberman, he says, you know, when someone is an introvert versus an extrovert, the way that we can biologically or neurobiologically measure that is that, say, we each get the same amount of dopamine through the experience. The introvert experiences all that dopamine in a much shorter amount of time, meaning it's almost like eating your meal really quick because you love it so much. But when you're done with that meal, you're going to go on to the next activity. That's like spending time with a person. An introvert is like, I'll spend time with that person, and after a short amount of time, I'll be done. But I'm going to thoroughly love the experience during the time spent with that person. Whereas the extrovert, it's like a long, drawn out time where you might experience the same amount of dopamine in a social setting, with a single person or a group of people, but it just takes longer to get your fix, right? It takes longer to get your dopamine fix. So you're there with people longer. That's more of a neurobiological perspective, right? And this is something that can also change. This is something that can also change. All right. I wasn't planning on going into all this, but it's totally relevant. So I'm going to tie it all in. Okay. So there's a thing called dopamine switching. There's long term and short term. Right now, we're talking about the long term, which is what activities have I trained my nervous system for so that I get a stronger amount of dopamine? So, is it video games? Is it pornography? Is it sex with a real person? Is it going to parties and barbecues and like spending my social time with people and just bebopping around, right? And so that is where someone who gets their dopamine fix from spending time with other people, and that really, there's like a large amount of dopamine, like that's going to mean that's going to be more rewarding to you, neurochemically rewarding, of the brain's dopamine reward system, than doing other activities that don't involve other people. So that will categorically, neurobiologically put you into being an extrovert. Dopamine switching, something that we all experienced, or most of us experienced during the pandemic, during the forced lockdown. It was like forced self isolation, right? What about the extrovert who lives alone in an apartment, but they were reliant on like going out all the time? That was a very similar thing to what I had experienced. And we had to force ourselves to dopamine switch away from spending time with people, and the subconscious mind adapts and it switches and it says, oh, now I'm dopamine switching into maybe more like Netflix or gaming or different ways of acquiring dopamine that don't involve being in the physical presence of another person. And I know that we can do things like Zoom meetings and Zoom calls, and you can be interacting with people, but it's through there's the digital way that's different. That's different, but you can acquire a lot of the same or similar things as being in person. It's not quite the same. It's not as good. We know that, right? Um, and so one of the things that I am currently doing intentionally is I know that I've dopamine switched away from getting a lot of my dopamine from being in the presence of other people. And I don't like that about myself. I want to be able to dopamine switch back towards spending time with other people in person, because most of my time with people over the past couple of years has been digitally online and like in a Zoom meeting, right? And I want to be able to balance that out with spending more time in person with people. So right now, I'm being intentional about when it feels like it's easier to just like, oh, I can just stay home and work on a project or watch Netflix or whatever. Like, no, Jessica, like it's a beautiful day. You have amazing friends who like to go hiking with you and, things like that. In a couple of weekends from now, I'm planning on hosting a barbecue. So I'm getting back into this, even though a lot of times right now it feels like a chore. And it's because I've dopamine switched away towards other activities. And now my intention is to dopamine switch back into getting a higher hit of dopamine while being in the presence of other people, because it feels amazing every time I go and do it. It feels so good. But before the activity takes place, like it kind of feels like a chore almost. It almost feels like a chore. And I know that I felt more, there was a part of me that was more satisfied and fulfilled when I did spend more time with people face to face, whether it's chilling, having some tea at the coffee shop, whether it's going for a hike in the forest, whether it's at a little a barbecue, whatever it might be, right? And so I'm dopamine switching over back to that, which means that neurobiologically switching more into being an extrovert, right? And so, because the confidence and the self-assuredness is there regardless. So that's not like, oh, I have to gain more confidence to want to be in the presence of other people. No, that's not how we do it. That's not how we categorize. And a lot of people will, going back to what I was saying earlier with the healing journey, a lot of people will heal and now they can show up with confidence. You don't have social anxiety anymore. You just have this either calm confidence or excited confidence, right? Or maybe maybe your more natural tendency was to be an extrovert, but your social anxiety was overriding your ability to enjoy the experience. And maybe now that you've healed, you're just bebopping out there with people all over the place, right? Okay, so I think I've covered this one pretty darn thoroughly. And we talked about fear of rejection and social anxiety and ways that people falsely categorize themselves as being an extrovert when really it might just mean you have deep emotional wounds of the past that need healing, so you can alleviate that fear of rejection and show up with confidence, right? We talked about how oftentimes the charismatic extrovert is really just those behaviors are subconscious and have showed up to receive an ego boosting high in order to achieve external validation because someone can't acquire that from within. Okay, so I think that we've really covered this a whole lot, like massively. And you may never think about introversion and extroversion the same ever again. And it may allow you to have some new self awarenesses. And perhaps those are self awarenesses that you can act on so that you can make some subconscious shifts within you to do that healing, right? And I'll share something with you. I'll share something with you. After I learned all of this and I did this healing, it honestly, it made me scared. It was one of my fears for a long time to show up with any amount of charisma, with any amount of that type of energy, right? And my fear was, oh, if I show up like that, people are just going to think that I'm trying to seek their approval or that I'm trying to um, ride this ego boosting high. And I was like, and it was preventing me from showing up in this world as a very real part of who I am. It's like, no, it's just straight up fun to like have that energy, right? It's fun. It neurochemically feels good. Even if there's no one there on the other side to receive it, it just feels good to be that way. And so I realized I was holding back from showing up in this world in a way that I feel is true to myself because I was scared that people would just say like, oh, think to themselves, oh, she's just doing that because she has subconscious fear of rejection, so she's trying to like put herself out there in this way. It's like, I used to do that, yeah. Oh, I used to do that, but it doesn't mean that if I show up in that way now, it doesn't mean that I'm doing it for the same reason. And so it took me a long time, and I'm still honestly getting back into it, where I now know that it's okay for me to show up in that way simply just because it feels good. Not, and knowing that I'm not showing up in that way anymore in order to get that reaction from another person, right? I don't need that reaction from another person because I've cultivated it from within. When you cultivate it from within, it doesn't matter how another person reacts or responds, right? That's the difference. That's the difference right there. And it is so empowering to be able to show up in this world now in a way that energetically feels the best and having a totally different meaning behind it. Having a different meaning behind it, right? A different reason, a different motivating factor. A different motivating factor. And so that's what I have for you. I had a lot of fun making this. When I go to make these videos, I just have a general idea of what I want to talk about. I thought this one would be like 15 minutes long. It's a lot longer than that. So, alrighty, signing off. I'll see you in the next video.